why is government clearly ignoring the danger signs around the worsening COVID-19 situation in order to reopen primary and secondary schools? What is it doing about disturbing general non-compliance with COVID-19 protocols it worked so hard to roll out? How much risk are the students and their teachers running by being shepherded into closed-in spaces that usually pass for classrooms in Nigeria? What should be the mode of teaching going forward, and how much interface has gone in between the school owners, Parents Teachers Association, and the government over the decision? Joining us now to go through all of this is Chinenye Mba-Uzoukwu, President, Institute of Software Practitioners of Nigeria, a trustee of the Education Reform Intervention Team, and member, Education and Manpower Thematic Work Group of the Federal Government Agenda 2050, where he continues to contribute to visioning and tactical execution of much-needed reform in the education sector. It's a pleasure having you on the program this year. Great to have you. Let's talk about some of these concerns.
Thank you very much.
Reopening of schools. We've been able to establish the fact on this show that last time we were reopening schools with testing. Now we're not even testing. It's just, oh, they came back from Christmas break, they're back to school, all like that. But we're quickly forgetting that this is not the Christmas break resumption. Normally, Christmas break will resume 7 or the 14th. That was always the calendar dates for that, as regards reopening in January. But we're in the middle of the second biggest pandemic in about 100 years of human existence. The first being in 1918, Spanish influenza, and now being coronavirus. Do people understand the temerity of this at all?
I think they do. I think it's a huge problem that every country, at the beginning of the pandemic, they calculated about 1.8 billion children were out of school across the world. And today, that number hasn't significantly reduced because every country is grappling with the same problem that Nigeria is. We're all caught between a rock and a hard place, and it's very difficult for everyone. And I think we need to accept that. Every stakeholder in the education ecosystem has a perspective. And if you look at them, you'll find that they sit on both sides of the fence. So I think government is in a very tough position, as well as all the other stakeholders. If the children don't go back to school, for example, it means that they're at home. And we need to understand that every single day in Nigeria, almost 100 million children are required to go to school in one way or the other at every level, from early childhood all the way through to tertiary education. So if these children are not able to go to school, then they have to be at home. If they have to be at home, they have to be supervised. I'm not even talking about education. I'm just talking about what happens when you have a family. Mother needs to go to work, father needs to go to work, and the children have to stay at home. How are they going to be supervised, even for daily living, let alone education itself? So on one side, parents are saying, well, we can't keep these children at home and work, and we have to work in order to bring money home. On the other hand, they're saying, well, we want to send them to school, but we want a safe environment. How do we resolve that problem? It's almost the same thing as well with government. Government and even school proprietors, for instance, the private sector, a large number of states in this country are dependent on the private sector education in order to take care of largely basic education. When you look at that, you say, okay, well, for the past 9 months or so, the private schools have been closed, but proprietors continue to pay salaries or not pay salaries at all. If you're a teacher and you're in the private sector education, you're not being paid. If you're in government, government still accumulates your salary. But if you're not being paid, and we recognize that private sector carries a huge burden in terms of education in this country, what do the school proprietors do? We have to ask ourselves whether they want to close the schools, retrench all their staff, and then what happens when we pick up? So it's a huge conundrum. I don't think anybody has really solved the problem anywhere in the world, and we have to address ours in our own peculiar way. And ultimately, I think it's going to come back to a fundamental question that we must ask ourselves, that there is the pandemic, and the pandemic has created massive disruption. Now we need to make a decision as to whether we're going to look back or we're going to look forward. And essentially, those are the two big groups that exist in our society, and particularly in the education sector. The look back people and the look forward people. And so long as we keep looking back, we cannot solve the problem in the present, and we certainly will not solve the problem in the future. So I think we need to go forward. And that requires some super tough decisions to be made.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, it's a question of striking a balance among many options, but it's also important to get that balance right so that we don't opt for counterproductive, solutions. But let me ask you, I see you are involved in the area of education reform. And one of the things we've been talking about is alternative modes of teaching and alternative modes of learning in the context of a pandemic like this. Now, how do we leverage technology to process those alternative modes that many persons have recommended, either in terms of virtual learning or distance learning or whatever label is attached to it? Is there something that can be done in the short term, considering the cost implications that may be involved?
There's a lot that can be done, but first of all, we need to make some very big decisions. And like I said, they're hard decisions. The first decision we have to make, I guess, is that we are not going to go back to education the way it was before. That has changed forever. The next is to look at the opportunity. So what lies ahead of us and what's the opportunity? And that opportunity is in line with the way that education is going worldwide. There is already a study published by the Harvard University that says that only 10% of the universities in the US will be in existence by the year 2030. That's in 10 years' time, from Harvard University itself. What happens to the other 600 universities? They're going to have to go to hybrid learning, 60% online, 40% on campus. And that's the trend that the world is going across all areas of education. And it's a difficult transition. So what do we have to do? We have to decide that we're going forward, and then we have to then, based on that, reprioritize our spending. Currently, what is happening is that we haven't made that decision to go one way or the other. And because we're sitting in the middle, our education budgets are reflecting exactly the same. Governments need to make decisions that say, well, you know what? We're going to over-invest in order to create the infrastructure that's required for schools to go online and for teachers to be enabled and for proprietors and regulators to be brought into that ecosystem. And we're going to make this hard decision today, because if we don't do that today, we may be in this quagmire for the next 5-10 years. And what does that really mean? It is, in essence, a lot of people talk about the internet as being a requirement for education. We don't have connectivity, we don't have this, we don't have that. Ruben, if you're in your house today and you put up a little Wi-Fi device in your house, maybe a MiFi, or even just a basic router that has no internet connectivity whatsoever, you can enable everybody in your house to connect to that router, and they will access learning on a system, a laptop or a tablet that sits within your house. Internet is only required for about 20 to 30% of learning, maybe even less. The bulk of what we need to learn can be learned offline. And what I mean by offline is you're connected on a system, but you're connected in a local area network. This is what we need to deploy. And I think across most states in Nigeria, particularly states like Lagos, the internet is not necessary for children to get access to learning. You actually can download and provide offline, quote unquote, access to learning resources without going to the internet even once. So the internet is not the issue. The connectivity is the issue, but internet is not the issue. We need to separate the two. So we can rapidly and comprehensively deploy a learning management system and learning education resources across Lagos State, for example, given its geography, within months. We just have to overinvest in terms of the demand. And the key question that is facing governments would be, can we do so with all the other priorities that we have in place? People are yelling about roads, people are screaming about traffic, others are talking about healthcare, others are talking about transportation, all sorts of problems. How do you overinvest in education to create this kind of capacity? We need to make those hard choices and to say to ourselves, well, you know what? The priority for us is this for now. In year 1, year 2, we will do this and we will do that. By year 3, we taper off and we reinvest in other ways. And I would say that what's very, very important is really at the state level. The states require 3 things. 1, they require very competent leadership in the areas of health and education. 2, they require access to data. They must have the data as a basis for making decisions around health and making decisions around education. And 3, they've got to have a will to continue to listen to the people, to continue to have a continuous dialogue with the people. And in that respect, I would say that Lagos is actually leading. They have very, very competent people in education and in health. And I think that the question really that's facing us is, Can the people get behind the government in a dialogue to agree that this is the strategy to take? Once that happens, you will see all other states can take an example for what's happening here. So it is possible. It isn't impossible. We just have to reprioritize and spend what we need to spend and be pretty brutal about taking that decision.
Chinenye, it's refreshing to hear that there are possibilities in this regard. And as we know, I mean, we've gone back and forth on how we feel about this decision for kids to go back to school. But we also know that the school is one of the primary agencies of socialization for children. So it's almost been caught between a rock and a hard place. You talk about some technologies that could be deployed or possibly have started, or the potential of it being deployed successfully, possibly in Lagos and other parts of the country. I want to talk about how effective that will work in the tertiary and higher institutions of learning. How quickly can that also be deployed given the right resources?
Okay, it all goes back to numbers, right? So when you look at schools, right, in Nigeria, there are almost approximately 89,000 schools, right, in the basic and secondary education space. In the university area, there are about 167 universities. 5.35% of that population is in private schools. The balance are in the public sector. So if we don't fix the public sector, we miss out 95% of the tertiary education population. Within the tertiary education space itself, there are less than 2 million people, including teachers. So when you look at what is being put into the tertiary education sector, you have to always keep in mind that this is a net population of 2 million people. Every year, we do like 1.5 million people take JAMB, and we admit between 500 and 700,000 every year. So net, over the past maybe decade or 2 decades, you're going to find that we only have about 1% of the nation's population in tertiary education. If we cannot provide online learning to 1% of our population, how do we provide that to the 90%? And like I said earlier, there are over 100 million that need to be in schools. So the summary of what I'm saying is that it's actually quite easy, relatively easy to take a decision. It's also relatively easy to fund it because tertiary education is providing students who are going almost directly into the workforce. If we look at a paradigm and assume that people are not learning to work, they're learning to earn and to work, learning to earn and to work, learning to earn and to work, and in a continuous cycle throughout their lifestyle, that we would make a fundamental change. So if you were to go into University of Lagos today, 40,000 students, another population maybe of another 30,000, this is 70,000 people. It cannot be inconceivable for us that we cannot provide 70,000 devices into a university environment. And I'll give the example of India. About 6 years ago, India decided that they were going to make a decision around their education system. They decided they were going to start working towards an online education for all, beginning with tertiary. They looked at devices and they decided they needed to come up with theirs that was cost effective. An iPad is about $400 to $600 a unit. They calculated that if we have about 18 million students in our universities, if 1 million of them buy iPads, that is $400 by 1 million, $400 million. They decided that they were going to produce a device that would cost less than $50. They did the design and the engineering, took it to China, built it, brought it back into their country at a cost of $60. The government subsidized that by 50%, and every student in India could get a device that was equivalent to a tablet device that was at the cost of $35, and that's the as-cash system. Today, that machine, that device has gone to multiple iterations because the Indians continue to invest in their local manufacturers and to improve on the quality of that device. So after 6 years, they now have a device that can compete with any other tablet on the market. And guess what? They're selling this device, still selling this device at a cost of $35. And the number actually drops based on how you scale. So as you go up to 18 million, your numbers will drop significantly in terms of the cost of production. We have a country of 200 million. We have 100 million people we need to educate. Why can't we do more or less the same?
That's a great question. Why can't we do it? That's a big question, but we'll take more on that question after the quick commercial break. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. We've got Chinenye Mba-Uzoukwu, President Institute of Software Practitioners of Nigeria, and also a trustee of the Education Reform Intervention Team and member Education and Manpower Thematic Group of the Federal Government's Agenda 2015. I could say that's a mouthful. But I'm really excited about what you're saying. And it's really interesting to me because I have seen countries that use education to change their world. And that's why I want to talk about curriculums now. Isn't it time to change it? A great country like Finland, now, it's easy to call it a great country. But out of, the Iron Curtain in 92, 93, Finland decided to skew its education to the developmental strides it wanted. So Finland set up things like Polytechnic that were quick, technical knowledge and things like that, equip these people for the workforce. And that's why Finland is doing quite well in terms of sciences and development today. Almost all the big tech companies come out of Nokia, Finland, Rogio, Angry Birds, Finland, because of the education system. And today when you talk about pizza ratings, Finland is atop. All of this started in 92, 93. How can we use our curriculum to change our curriculum in such a way that our education will power the economy and the development we want in our country?
Okay, so a great example, and let me go back to the question that we closed with in the last segment. Ultimately the first decision is around two kinds of people: the look back and the look forward people. And currently, the look back people are winning, and the look back people are those who are unable to make that leap into that future. And so the decisions and the policies that are coming from are compromises as opposed to wholesale commitments. We have to go all in, and that's what Finland did. What you just described. Finland has had 35 years of an unbroken education policy. In fact, the education policy in Finland is anchored by the constitution, and it is justiciable in the sense that you cannot break from that. No government that comes to power can change that policy without going back to go and change the constitution. And you're held 100% accountable. So they have their education now. And remember, it's a small country, about 4 million people or thereabouts. You have 99.999% enrollment. We can't say the same thing for Nigeria. And a child in Switzerland has a right to education that is backed by the courts of law. In Nigeria, it's in our constitution, but there's also an out in our constitution that says where possible. The Child Rights Act and the Nigerian constitution guarantee the child a right to free education, but it says where practicable. Practicable is a clause that allows you to out from. That's really what is happening now. Currently, we're finding that we are not necessarily meeting up with what that requirement is because we've given ourselves an out. Coming to the issue of curriculum, it is only one part of a larger story. Let's look at the entire ecosystem and see what would happen. If we were to inject computers into learning, if we were to inject software into learning, a few things would happen. One, the teachers themselves need to be trained in new pedagogy for blended learning. They need to learn how to teach. They will upgrade their. Two, the teachers will become publishers of content because they would, rather than use and consume content that has been created, every time a teacher creates a lesson plan and turns that lesson, it becomes content that can be income earner on top in the school. In the same way, software companies will be enabled. You would see a surge, just like you see the surge in Zoom shares. We ought to have seen a massive surge in terms of the growth of learning companies in Nigeria, companies that are building software for online learning. We ought to have seen a surge in terms of every other ancillary industry that feeds into that space. It has not happened. In the same way, you would have seen curriculum itself changing. Because curriculum can only be, right now, what we're doing is that we're working with curriculum that is locked in. Changing that curriculum for us happens every 3 to 5 years. And by the time it's coming out, that curriculum is already obsoleted. Today, what happens in other countries and other economies that are progressive, that they've understood that there must be a lot more fluidity and agility around the education system. You cannot have that without introducing massively introducing technology into the equation. And it's not just between the teacher and the student, it's also from an administrative point of view. So we need to be able to assess students every single day, not every 3 months. We need to be able to assess students in each subject as the class is finishing and see the results. The teacher needs to know who is challenged and what can we do to help that student. We need to go to individualized learning. We need to be able to provide the regulators a clear view, which takes us also back to COVID. We talk about the COVID environment in the schools and compliance. But the most important thing that we need in the schools today is not even the testing. It's the monitoring of the health conditions in that environment which has to happen every single day. If we reintroduce testing on Monday, will you also test the children on Tuesday and on Wednesday and on Thursday and on Friday? Because they come to school with their teachers every single day and they go back home. And the majority, so when they go to school on day one and they test negative and they're going home in the evening, supposing the teacher now comes in contact with somebody who's COVID positive. The teacher comes to school on Tuesday. Are you going to test the teacher again on Tuesday? At the cost of 50,000 naira per test, it's completely impracticable. So we must go to a different thing altogether. And again, it goes back to the same thing, technology. We have to introduce software and hardware technology systems and solutions that change the game fundamentally by being able to capture data, aggregate that data, analyze that data, and help the government make smart decisions to be made where there's COVID outbreaks or potential COVID outbreaks. All over Lagos today, people take temperature readings. What happens to the temperature readings? They fall to the ground. They're not aggregated. So you walk into a store, you come back out. You go to a bank, in that process, you may pick up COVID. So there are things that have to be done that are fundamental, and they all go back to the question of looking forward. Let's not try to do what we've been doing in the past or try to recreate that. That is spent trying to recreate the past is essentially just a waste of time. It would only bring us to a position that we were in, which was already very far behind the rest of the world. So now we need to take the opportunity and leap forward. But to do that, we all have to get to that space and that point where we are convinced that the only way is forward. And as I always argue with people when I have this discussion, when you're in the middle of a storm, the worst thing you can do is to stand still. You don't stop rowing. What you need to do is you need to power through. COVID is a storm. We don't even know where the edge of the storm is. But so long as we stay asking ourselves, dithering and making decisions and asking whether we should go back, then the greater the risk of capsizing. So we need to find a way to get the energy, the courage, and also the vision to power through and get out of that storm. That's really what we have to do. Hard decisions covering curriculum, pedagogy, technology, professional development of teachers, and the whole gamut of education, and even content. And I do want to say, don't get it wrong. What we are advocating is not a wholesale launch of technology. What we're saying is that we need to go to hybrid learning and blended learning pedagogies. And one way to do that would be to support the teachers with the computers, support the children with access to the technology. But it would never replace the teacher, and it would never replace the school experience where you need to get there every single day. So where we can have what we define as the flipped classroom. The learning happens at home using the tools of technology, and the children then go into school to go and lock down and seek answers from teachers in presence and from their peers around what they may have had difficulty with. That way, we can reduce the amount of visits that have to be made to the school. We can manage the number of children that have to leave their houses and get into public transportation every single day. And we can increase our children's affinity and uptake and preparedness for the 21st century, which is all about technology anyway.
Well, I guess, there's very little to argue about with regard to upscaling the education sector, transforming it, reforming it from whatever dimension we may identify. But one critical element appears to be missing. If you look at all the countries where the education system has been transformed, whether it's Canada or Finland or Germany or Japan or Sweden, there's the element of leadership, a committed leadership that understands the fact that the competitive edge of their countries would need to be sharpened for them to be able to compete in a world that has become even more competitive. Where in Nigeria are we going to get that critical mass, visionary leadership, both at the federal level and at the state levels, to be able to understand all of these issues and begin to work towards those issues? We have policies in place. We have a national policy on education that talks about a 60-40 division in terms of emphasis on science and the arts or the humanities. But who follows that? Who measures the outcomes? So where are we going to get that critical mass? Because we've been having this conversation almost forever.
It's a great question, and again, I'm not sure I have the answers or full answers, but I can suggest a few things, and some of them we've said during this conversation. I think a lot of the time when you may have committed leadership, when you may find yourself in committed leadership, there are a couple of other elements that are not in place. First of all, leadership needs to carry along the people, particularly in an issue like education. The parents are critical stakeholders in this conversation, and unless they understand what the stakes are and what the issues are, they will withdraw their support. I mean, parents were demanding for the opening of the universities. It's their children that they're sending to universities. So they know that there's COVID, but they want the universities open, and they want to send their children to universities. They are not crazy people. They love their children. Nobody wants his child to be put in a situation of risk. But they do recognize that without an education, that the children themselves would become more of a problem than they are a benefit to the family. So there is a conversation that has not yet been had at the level that we believe it needs to be had. And that conversation needs to lead us to a consensus around what it is that must be done. It cannot be done with the unions, and it cannot be done through the unionized positions that ASU is taking. Your earlier guest was saying that there is almost like a relay race within. How can we know that there's a relay race in place? And as a society, we agree and commit. ASU wants its own, NASU wants its own, NANS wants its own. Doesn't show a society that has reached a level of conviction around what must be done around education. What it looks like more are people trying to take care of themselves in a very narrow, and I would even venture to say selfish manner. So there is a national conversation that has to be had, particularly around things like education. It's only then that committed leadership can actually work. There's very little that you can do as a minister, or even as a commissioner for education, or even as a governor, or even a school proprietor, without carrying the stakeholders along. And the stakeholders are the parents, the teachers, the children themselves. So we must get to a place where we start to have that conversation. Right now, it's not really there. We're still in that stage where we are like trying to make up our minds and compromising.
Chinenye Mba-Uzoukwu, that's all we'll be able to take. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.